Welcome to this virtual presentation. I'm excited to discuss two topics today of interest to me, one being conservation planning and agricultural landscapes, and the second one being really how do we educate those who are interested in partnering in these initiatives, both the agricultural landowners and students who are entering a career where they're going to be asked to lead these types of agri-environmental initiatives. Any discussion of nature and agriculture brings to mind images of hedgerows and small scale production. And many of these, mental images are actually borrowed from, historical context. And in reality, these are, cultural practices, many of which were, brought to North America by European settlers, where we really focused on kind of what was still continuing to occur in terms of, natural systems or ecosystem services at the margins around agriculture. And while some of that same mental imagery still persists, the reality of where we're at today is that we very much have industrialized the agricultural landscape. And it's an important part of our food production system, but it was created by a very intentional series of policies that began after World War II that have collectively become known as the Green Revolution, that encourage, the removal of non-production elements of the landscape. And so, as a result, what we see, using Indiana as an example, is that today only about 1.5% of all of the agricultural lands in Indiana is set aside in conservation, and realistically, more than 83% of all agricultural lands are actually in direct row crop production, meaning that all of the, the infrastructure, the pasture, any woodlots that are associated with it, all of those other elements only represent, a small part of the overall landscape. It's important to remember that history has shown that top-down planning efforts that depend on voluntary adoption are unlikely to reduce the loss of natural systems in the agricultural landscape. Specifically, it's important to understand that we must rely on engaging the farming community both as partners, but also as problem solvers. And this requires some additional training and conservation planning that conveys landscape analysis skills and spatial problem solving skills that are just not natural for farmers. It's not a skill set that they actively have in most cases. We're not there yet, but ClimateBufferNet is ultimately intended to help support farmers and others interested in partnering in these efforts come to a common vocabulary and understanding of these issues. But even when we have local landowner buy-in, we often lack an end goal, a specific measure of what needs to be done to the landscape, how much land needs to be set aside to achieve these multifunctional benefits that are necessary to support critical ecosystem services. There are examples like a 2017 paper published by Dr. Lisa Schulte and her team at Iowa State University that tested a conversion of 10% of the agricultural landscape into prairie strips, which did demonstrate kind of these significant benefits both to water quality, protection, and biodiversity improvement. But, is that the actual number? What are we really asking of producers? What is the ultimate ask of farmers? How will they know when they've done enough? These are important, especially as we start to look at, balancing competition for land, and how that affects producers' bottom line. Using ClimateBufferNet, we believe that playing through a series of simulations that accurately reflect this balancing of both natural land uses to provide ecosystem services with production, working landscapes is an important aspect of building capacity to address this complex issue. And ClimateBufferNet really has three goals. And these were developed with support from a number of practitioners who participated in 2 international webinars we hosted, and also some policy research that we conducted with practitioners in the United Kingdom. And these three goals really kind of revolve around seeking to explore spatial solutions to the restoration of green infrastructure and agricultural landscapes, but also to build knowledge about the types of practices that can be implemented to enhance the health of the landscape, and then finally to actively negotiate new strategies that balance land use between agricultural and ecosystem services. And the final one there is really recognizing that the economic production goals of the landscape need to be met, or we'll lose the farms, right? And so that has to be an active part of this conversation. We also visited with farmers who are incorporating natural systems into their production model, focusing on development of land management practices that benefit the economic, social, and environmental health of their farm. The development of the ClimateBufferNet simulation went through many stages to explore potential focus variables, spatial problem-solving strategies, and their impact on the landscape, as well as significant programming constraints that involved a year-long kind of give and take with our game programmers. And you can see here that, from basic idea on the whiteboard through a series of play tests, it really helped us kind of refine what it was we were trying to achieve in our specific learning outcomes for this project. And this all led to the game board that you see here in front of us. And this is a digital video game platform that can be deployed on any computer. And students and players go through the process here, of working within this 1,000 acres of farmland. Our hope is that we'll eventually be able to go ahead and expand this out to something a little bit larger than this, but this was a good starting point for us because we wanted to keep this fine scale to the conservation practices. And so each one of the squares that you see here in this grid represents a 50 by 50 foot area. And so at that 50-foot width, we are approximating, the minimum width necessary for effective conservation practices. So we actually feel like we can balance this. But the starting game board that the players are introduced to is primarily production, and it really represents kind of that 1% to 2% in natural systems that we were talking about before. The game board also included a simple stream network and associated topography. Topography was really important to us during the development of the game process. It is one of the more challenging things that we had to work through with our programmers. Specifically, this added a layer of complexity to what they were trying to do. Even as we're overlaying multiple different pieces of information on top of this, we needed a way to visually represent this. So one of the solutions that they provided us with is in-game, you can actually switch between a 2D, so top-down view looking at a map, and a 3D view that allows you to zoom in and around the landscape and actually take a look at this. And so allows you to check out kind of this simple stream network, but we've also brought in some other elements here. The roads that we've incorporated into the game board here help kind of break apart the landscape. They're, again, speaking different languages from the developers, we still have some needs to go in and modify this landscape somewhat more based on feedback from our playtesting. But again, we'll talk about some of that here in just a minute. Now, the users can view landscape data on biodiversity, yield, and runoff potential to make decisions within the game. The yield map shown here on this slide is a good example of the type of hotspot analysis that we'll provide to players to help them determine, both the impact of their decisions, but also the potential impact of conservation practices on the landscape. And so you can start to see where a player is going to have to look at both yield data and then also look at, how well suited is a particular part of the landscape to the practice that they're trying to actually go ahead and place on the landscape. That's an important kind of give and take that we want players to have to manage and deal with those kinds of decisions. And what we ask players to do is that in each of 3 rounds, they have an opportunity to go ahead and place these different types of practices. So we've provided them with 5 different conservation practices, as well as restoring corn production, so they can actually take land that they don't feel is well suited for natural systems and take it out and put it back into production. And so they have an opportunity to do this, and then they can actually see in real time how that impacts both the environmental indicator and the farm production indicator scores that are developed based on where they place those practices within the landscape. To go beyond a game of just kind of painting these across the landscape, we also want players to recognize what are each one of these conservation practices. Some of these are really summary in nature, and so we do go ahead and reference within kind of this game card that pops up for the players when they select it to find out more information. They can actually learn about some of the, within a riparian area, what are some of the different practices that could actually be deployed on the landscape. But it's also important here within this guide that we talk about placement considerations, the potential impact, what benefits can be derived from it. Are there any production benefits? Is something that comes up time and time again in these discussions. But we also included the different types of plant species. And the idea being there is that it gives a pathway for students to kind of start to branch out and understand how this can connect back to biodiversity, or maybe what kind of nitrogen uptake does a particular type of family of plants really provide within the landscape as you're placing them there. And finally, at the conclusion of 3 rounds, the game then shows the players a final summary screen where they can actually take a look and see if they've successfully navigated both the profit and environmental protection goals for managing farmland. The most likely occurrence, based on our spring 2020 play test, isn't a perfect solution to this, but what we actually saw was more what you see on the right, which is that players were very overeager to place conservation practices. This includes the group of players that was assigned to a producer role where they were supposed to maximize corn production on the landscape. But ultimately, most of the players in the playtest lost the farm due to financial realities of removing land from production. And so this is part of, we want, students had an opportunity to play through this a couple of different times, and this lesson starts to sink in over time. But at least in this initial playtest, we saw that over-eagerness to drop conservation practices be pretty universal. And as part of this, initial playtest, we had very small, I had 11 students in a senior level capstone course in landscape architecture that participated in, pilot testing this. And this is part of the development process for us. So these are very much preliminary results. But what we wanted them to do was just give us an indication. So we did go ahead and have them fill out a short questionnaire at the end, the conclusion of their playtest with ClimateBufferNet. And what we saw is that we saw most, 70% of players were actively using the information layers that we, expected them or provided them with to make decisions about where to place conservation buffers on the landscape. But the other thing that came through is that 60% of the players, so a majority of the players, didn't feel like they had all of the information they needed prior to going into the game. And so that's something that we take note of, because these students have had some coursework in this area. They also had some additional training and readings that went with this. And so this is the complexity of bringing people into this, is that it continues to provide, need to provide resources and opportunities to learn within game. Afterwards, what you saw was a much stronger agreement that they'd actually started to internalize and really learn from the experience of playing ClimateBufferNet. This is what we're hoping for, and what we hope to continue to be able to test more rigorously moving forward into the future. We also took this as an opportunity to just get some suggestions from the students for how to improve. Where do we go next with the development of ClimateBufferNet? And amongst them, you're going to start to see that the interactivity, the focus on kind of the balancing between the production and the environmental scores were things that stood out as real positives. But the students also wanted more, ways to visualize biodiversity. They wanted enhanced visuals for how the landscape looked. When they placed a tree buffer, they want to see the trees. These are all things that we're actively working on. And then ideally, in the end summary screen, we want students to be able to go back in, select on any one of these individual tiles, and be able to pull up some additional information about that. Whether that be, pulling up an image of it, or to actually go in and model out, some photo visualizations that actually provide them with more information. This is how we're going to extend the dialogue beyond just the gameplay. And ideally, we can get back to speaking about the individual benefits of specific species, the ecosystem services they can provide. This is the kind of information and dialogue we want to have with game players in the ClimateBufferNet simulation. And there are a number of partners that I'd like to thank for their involvement in this project, but specifically the Purdue University's Provost's Office for providing the Instructional Innovation Grant that funded this initial build of ClimateBufferNet. We're really excited about where things can go next, and I'd be interested to hearing from any of you who have questions about serious games and their application in agricultural conservation.